My name is John. I'm a technical lead and co-founder at Zirkit. Zirkit's a lot of things. We built a zero knowledge rollup, and then we decided what else could we do? And one thing we could do is bring institutional finance on chain through a product that we call Zirkit Finance, and that's our focus now. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the technical parts of that because it's a little bit interesting. I think it's something that might be obvious, but you also might not know how. Some of these protocols or DeFi apps sort of are built in the modern era, right? You might still be thinking about single chain applications or Uniswap clones or something like this. And so I'm just going to dive into the architecture just a little bit. It's not super technical. You're not going to see like a bunch of function interfaces or Solidity smart code, but just the idea of what we're building. And then a little bit about what the product is and then we'll be done. So without further ado, what are we trying to build? Well, we want to try to build cross-chain DeFi. If you did see the panel earlier today with the L2 participants that I was on, I like to reference this stat that last year in October, there was about 131 L2s or rollups listed on L2Beat. That's a lot. That means a lot of fragmentation on liquidity. That is not great. But we don't want those chains to necessarily have to do all of their own sort of network effect building or, build out their own solutions. Having multiple copies of a single DApp like Uniswap is not an ideal way. And there are ways to solve this that, big players in the space are trying to solve. For example, the use of based rollups might remove some of that altogether. But actually, at the application layer, which is a little bit more attainable for smaller teams to build out, we can actually also build apps in with this in mind. So what do we actually want? Well, we'd ideally like to simplify our lives and have a single vault somewhere because we don't want to be managing rebalancing liquidity or updating multiple things, but we don't want it to be necessarily only accessible from a single chain. In fact, you should be able to deposit and withdraw from it from any set of supported chains that you like. So if you like to have money on base, put some money in some dApp, that's great. But if you're an Optimism user, you should also be able to access this app. There's no reason not to, right? This is a modern day and age. We can architect this. The challenges that come with that, though, is race conditions if we start to bridge things. So what happens if your shares or your accounting goes out of whack? On one chain, there might be some price action for something. On another chain, there might not be. That gives arbitrage opportunities, and it complicates your life as a developer and confuses you as a user if you see weird yields coming to and from things. And if we can do all of that, if we can solve all the technical problems, which I will argue we can, you want to be able to use this app in ways that are beneficial for the users, namely, take your assets and put it wherever it gets the best funds for the users. You're no longer constrained to the best yield on your chain. You're constrained to the best yield on any of the chains you support, and that's a really nice thing you can do. So why is this hard? This is hard because obviously most rollups don't talk to each other. By default, they have a single bridge to Ethereum. There are bridging solutions out there. You got to pick one, you got to build on it. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but it does add a point of pain. So, using Chainlink or using LayerZero, you're using something else, there are things you need to build. And then if you look at the standards to do this, because you don't want to reinvent the wheel, A, because the wheel is very nice, and B, because in this world you have to audit your wheel every time you change something. You want to look at standards, and your common vault standard these days is ERC 4626, which is very popular. It's got a good interface, but it really doesn't have multi-chain support out of the box. Actually, it's just designed for one chain, and so this on its own doesn't do everything. So we can be a little bit clever about how to solve that, and we'll show that soon. And then you just got to worry about bridging itself. Is there latency? Do you need high performance? Do you need low latency? You do need fees, and you do need to know what happens if one of your chain doesn't do something correctly, like a transaction gets dropped or reorged or something. But if you can overcome all of that, this is pretty straightforward. And then it's just an accounting problem. And I will argue that's not so hard if you keep everything on one chain. And how can we do this? Well, how did we do it at Zirkit Finance? It was actually pretty straightforward. We just built out a hub and spoke model. So we can take that singular ERC 420 or 4626 vault, and you can put that on a particular chain. It doesn't matter which one. You probably want it to be cheap and fast and reliable so that you're not charging users a lot and they have a pretty good UX. And then what you can do is you can issue shares of this token vault in OFTs or other bridging solutions. We're going to use LayerZero. We just happen to do it. You might be scared of that because of some recent incidents, but if there's no supply chain hacks and everything's so configured right, LayerZero is still a very strong, good technology, so there's no reason to be sort of scared of that on its own. And what we can do is have those shares issued as OFTs, which are Omnichain fungible tokens. I'll say a little bit more about that near the middle of the talk. And those are tokens that are inherently sort of tied to the LayerZero protocol, and now you can move them to and from different chains. So anywhere that there's a LayerZero endpoint, you can take withdrawals. So you can take deposits or give users withdrawals, no matter where they actually put the money in the first place. So that's pretty straightforward, and it just means we have to build out two parts. The first part is a hub. So this is the vault itself. Just got to put it on a chain somewhere. You're going to be issuing shares in the same manner that you want on any other vault, except this time it's going to be an OFT, as I mentioned. And this will just always be your source of truth. So no matter what happens, you're going to get tokens to and from this vault through the LayerZero bridging act. And whatever this vault says is final, you're just going to treat as final, and everything will reconcile later. And then you can do things like compose if you want. This is a nice interface. It looks like other vaults. You can get some good strategies going, that type of thing. And then every time you want to move assets, use OFTs. And correspondingly, on every chain that you want to have users talk to your app on, you build out just sort of a spoke. And this is essentially just an interface that wraps the OFT into or out of whatever digital assets you care about. So if you want to deposit, you deposit. Your RFT mints some share. Your share eventually gets transmitted back to the hub chain. All of this works wherever you want it on whichever chain, and that's it. Now you don't need to worry about where the assets actually are coming from, because you're sort of sending it to the main vault anyways. And then you can actually um, move things between different endpoints anyways, different spokes. Usually you want to do that through the vault itself, because the vault is the single source of truth that we're trying to build out. So you have to maybe swap between A and B through this hub chain, but it's not too bad if the delays between transactions are not too high. So let's go into LayerZero just a little bit, because it is an integral part of this design, and it's one that people may have questions about, especially due to recent incidents. So what is it? LayerZero is just a bunch of endpoints where you can deploy on multiple chains, and they will define some interfaces where you can establish a digital token in this OFT standard, and the standard will basically let you move things between each other through things called executors, and they will have systems called DVMs, which I'll talk about soon, where you pass messages from one chain to the next. So it's actually pretty straightforward, and if the DVMs are configured correctly, and if you have sufficiently many of them, it's a totally safe and good system. The OFT is where you're actually going to end up using as a user. We're going to abstract all it away from you in the case of Circuit Finance. And most apps, probably, you don't actually need to tell the user what token standard you're building on. But I wanted to make this a little bit more technical and say, this is one of the standards that are out there. In fact, I think one of the reasons this is worth pointing out is that if you look at different bridging protocols, they will all have different token standards. They all look and feel like ERC 721 or ERC 20, depending on the use case, to some extent, but they're not interchangeable out of the box. If you start to commit to a bridging protocol, actually what you're typically doing is also committing to their standard. And they're not really different, but OFTs are not necessarily going to work exactly with Chainlink's CCIT, for example. Are they significantly different? No. But you do need to change your tests. You do need to change your code. And so actually picking one of your standards is somewhat important if you are looking to build a product. If you're just a user, it doesn't matter, and it's all going to be good. But essentially, once you have one of these tokens on the spokes, you're going to have these OFTs living around, and they will be issued to and from messages with the actual hub chain through something called an OFT adapter. And this is also one of those pieces that changes if you use a different bridging infrastructure. Messages on LayerZero are passed between different chains using something called a DVM. You may have seen some stuff about not only using one of them, so you should have multiple DVMs, and they should be configured in good ways. But this is one nice perk of LayerZero, is actually that you have a lot of control when you're building out a multi-chain app using LayerZero. One of the reasons we like using LayerZero is that you get to change who your DVMs are and the thresholds you want for that. So if you make it sufficiently robust and sufficiently diverse, you get a really nice system. If you want something that's quick and trust-centered, you can reduce that, but you do that at your own risk. Again, changes depending on the bridge protocol, but it's still something that's useful. Okay, so let's jump very quickly into the smart contract architecture. I've already sort of said the high-level stuff, and I'm not going to go too much deeper. On the hub chain, what do we want? Well, we want this vault that looks and feels like anything else in DeFi. And for that, we're going to use ERC-4626. It's pretty straightforward. We're going to take assets, we're going to issue you shares, and you can do whatever you want with the shares. And, the assets can be traded back for shares or vice versa at any point. And we can use this as a single source of truth, right? Critically, what is nice here in this design is if you actually build up this vault using LayerZero, you don't need to have the vault be aware of the other chains. It just issues shares that happen to conform to the OFT standard, and then those can move around as you want. But your actual vault implementation is fairly straightforward and fairly simple. You can just sort of fork it. Most of the tests will work. You don't need to do anything inherently multi-chain on this design. On the other hand, the tokens, these OFTs, they obviously need to be very multi-chain. They're going to be moving around different chains. You're going to be trading them in different places. You're going to be accepting funds in different places. So you need to have an OFT that represents these shares, and that's totally fine. But what is really important, if you go down this route, is that you maintain the vault being the single source of truth. So anytime you mint assets or you burn assets that are OFTs on a different chain, on one of these spoke chains, you do want to make sure you send messages to and from the hub, and the hub is sort of confirmed or acknowledged that this is happening. So you really want this hub to be the single source of truth. It will simplify your life. It'll mean failure modes go away in a lot of cases, and others are easier to handle. This is pretty straightforward. And then you have to do a little bit of work to get some of the UX work to be very, very smooth, especially if you want users to be able to withdraw on one chain and deposit on another, or vice versa. Essentially, you can do this if you always go through your central hub, though. That's pretty straightforward. Takes a little bit longer, but it's totally fine. You can skip that if, there's certain cases, in particular, if you're on the hub chain as a user. So if you choose a good hub chain, that's fine. But then once you do that too, you can also use the OFT endpoints in ways that compose to other assets. So you can actually have strategy managers on each one of your spokes or on the hub chain itself to actually put money to where we want it to go. So this means as a dApp developer, you can provide yield to your users on any one of the chains that you support. That's really nice. That's really convenient because it means if you have a good opportunity on Base that doesn't exist in Optimism, you can still get some of the money from Base and put into Optimism or vice versa, or any of the other OFT supported networks that you build on. So this is actually a critical part. And this sounds fairly straightforward and fairly obvious, but I think this is some sort of design that actually, wasn't possible until we saw Interop come alive in the last couple of, let's say, years, right? It's been a bridging revolution to some extent. All right, so I won't bore with some of the other stuff I talked about. The capital allocation, I think I already spoke a little bit about. You can do stuff when your vaults look and feel like the ones that are out there anyways. 4626 is used by Morpho. So when you start to think about integrations and putting capital into some of these positions, if you know how to code with your hub vault, you can do this pretty straightforward. All the interfaces are there, but you can also do other things. Of course, you can always do other things. So you can do things like that. And I will skip some of that. But essentially, anytime you want to deploy capital, you put it on the right chain, you put the stuff in the shares, you make sure the hub is always keeping track of it. And then to reverse it, or to withdraw, you reverse it. And so why am I telling you all of that? Not just because I think it's an interesting design that someone should go out and build. I give this talk sometimes at a hackathon where I do want to see if people understand, if it's difficult or if there's some nuance, but also because we built it out into a product. And I didn't want to spend 20 minutes up here shilling a product, but I do want to say that actually we built this design to get you yield on multiple chains. Circuit, was very involved in a bunch of chains, and so we wanted to make a cross-chain solution so that we didn't have to necessarily get people onto a single chain to do it. And we built out Circuit Finance. And so Circuit Finance is a place where you can deposit funds and you can earn yield on stablecoins, USDC and USDT. And I'll give you a quick rundown of the stats. We're targeting 8 to 11%, which we think is very competitive. This is going to be better, I think, than most pools on Aave or Morpho because they're not over collateralized loans. We generate yields by giving funds to asset managers. So asset managers that we work with actually will generate yield in however ways that they want. Generally, they're institutional partners. There's a logo wall coming up. If you don't know who I'm talking about, I will say some soon. But essentially, we work with these partners and they do yield and good things. There's a small performance fee, but you don't have to deposit anything big, right? So actually, what we want to do is provide institutional capital without a minimum lockup period or a minimum deposit size. In this case, there is a bit of a withdrawal time in some cases if the asset manager has put your funds into a system that it needs some time to recover funds from. But that's why we can also talk to apps like Morvo or Aave to have quick liquidity. And we can build on any LayerZero chain we want. Currently, we're live on Base on Ethereum just because we had to start somewhere. And as the system grows and gains adoption, we'll add more chains. So what do we actually do? Well, the funds are deposited and then they're exchanged for shares of basically funds managed and operated by people like Monarch, Fortius. We just announced Wisdom Tree 2 days ago. I think it was 2 days ago. So essentially, we get yield for you and your USDC and USDT from sources that don't normally exist on chain. So we're actually bringing institutional capital on chain for you. We're not necessarily going into DeFi native primitives, which means this is a lot more safe in a lot of ways because you don't have weird looping. You don't have a lot of technical lift where you can introduce technical risk. Of course, there's smart contracts. They have been audited, all of that, but it's a fairly straightforward system. So in short, though, the whole idea of the talk was you can put two things together, namely ERC-4626, which is, I think, something that we don't talk about enough, even though a lot of people in DeFi, which is still the biggest use case in Ethereum and the ecosystem, is running on. I haven't seen a talk about 4626 in a while. Maybe I missed one today. If I did, I apologize. But I think people should know what it is because just like ERC-20, it's everywhere. And trying to figure out why this is useful, how it's used is nice. But then also OFTs and LayerZero. I don't work for LayerZero, so I didn't want to necessarily just shill it. But it is a really good technology, and despite again maybe some issues that some people have had with it, it is still a solid bridging technology, and there are still ways you can make it do really cool stuff, even if these designs don't seem very technical. In fact, I would argue that simpler solutions are better in a lot of ways because it makes it easier for you to check everything. And then we can actually build it into a product. We did. You get 8 to 11%, like I said, on stables. Check it out. It's live now. You can put money in now. If you have any questions, feel free to reach me at one of these. Jay Gorzny is Telegram or Twitter. And I guess I'm a little under time, so I have time for questions. Thank you.